love being in a room like this. Wow, the power, the professionalism of all these accomplished women. I want to say that you have a fantastic panel ahead of you. 3 CEOs of financial organizations, Jane, Becky, and Sarah, and a fantastic endowed, chaired professor in finance. Let me tell you that all of them are rarities. First of all, Andrea Eisfeld is an endowed chair in finance. I have to say the only endowed chair at the moment in our school. And the fact that she's an endowed chair in finance across the country is rare. And then let me talk about female CEOs in finance. I'm on the advisory board of Catalyst, and Catalyst does all of these numbers. And I should mention, by the way, I'm Judy Olian. I'm the dean of this. I'm the dean of this school. So you've just got this. We like concentrating power in women in the school. Actually, the 2 biggest programs of the 4 biggest programs are also headed by women because they're talented. And so we're very proud of the power of women at Anderson. So looking at the numbers at Catalyst, you know, the finance industry is not exactly at the forefront of female representation. So Catalyst says that among mid-managers in finance, 46% are women. Among senior managers in finance, 29% are women. And guess what percent of CEOs in finance are women? No, there are women here. I mean, they've got to be more than 0.
Well, that's a lot of large numbers.
But we've probably captured half of the universe right here, more than half. There's one other person who's actually on our board, is Joan Payton, who's a great institution here. But we have, yeah, we've captured the universe. It's actually 2%. It's 2%. From Bloomberg, a couple more numbers. Among women, less than 10% of all U.S. fund managers are women, and 2%, as we said, run industry assets and open-end funds. And the comparative numbers among men is 74% of assets, 78% of funds. And you're asking, okay, what's the rest? The rest might be mixed teams. So what we have here is the universe almost of the female CEOs, a power group, and whether it's the academic side, and Jane was also an academic in part of her life. And you know, as we look to a world in which we, and I'm going to make a political statement here, hope to have the highest office in this country held by a woman. I made a political statement. We should be doing more in the field of finance. And I think we're going to hear some great things led by Andrea about leading, about markets, about being entrepreneurs, because each of these women is also an entrepreneur. And I really want to thank the panelists and Andrea for serving tonight for what will be a very special evening, because you just don't get this kind of lens and perspective in most other places, because it would be a sea of men, usually. So we're in for a special treat, and I want to really congratulate Laura Clark, who is co-founder of this group, and she's an EMBA of 2012. We'll claim her as our own. And I could almost have claimed her twice, because she's also a Penn State graduate, which is where I was before I came here, but you just preceded me before I got there. Laura is managing director at Los Angeles Capital, which is a global equity firm. Before that, and there she leads, by the way, biz development with institutional clients for most of the country, actually, Midwest, Southern, Western, I guess the only thing that's left is the Northeast and the Southeast. Now, before that, she was at Starmine Corporation at Thomson Financial. And Laura and the other co-founder is, where is Heather? Where is Heather? Heather. Laura and Heather founded this great group, which is Women in Institutional Investments Network, WIN, and founded it 2 years ago with now 200 members, a lot of whom are here. It is a fantastic networking opportunity. I have found that when women get together, connections happen in a more meaningful way than just normal groups. And I'm so thrilled that WIN joined with the Think Center to host tonight's special event. And we at Anderson are delighted to be able to have you here. I hope that this also sparks your interest in coming back to lots of other Anderson events. There are quite a few MBAs sprinkled through the audience here. It's never too late to come back to Anderson, whether it's for a degree or an executive program or one of these fantastic events. So please welcome Laura.
Thank you so much, Dean Olian. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Think Center for Finance and Investments and the UCLA Anderson School of Management for hosting us here this evening. We have a wonderful audience. We have a wonderful panel. So this is definitely a special evening. I'm Laura Clark, as Dean Olian said. I'm co-founder and co-president of WIN and also an Anderson alum. So this evening is quite special because I came first here to Anderson about 6 years ago in this very room for a women's event, actually, for prospective students called Heart to Heart. And it was such an inspiring and empowering evening. I met such wonderful women, some of my classmates that are here tonight, that I decided that Anderson was the place for me, and I wanted to be part of the community. So I spent a lot of time in this room, eating, doing projects, et cetera, and forged some amazing relationships, and again, happy to have my classmates here. Anderson and WIN are incredibly important organizations to me, and they've really helped shape myself and my career, and then also WIN. That gave me the entrepreneurial spark to co-found the organization 2 years ago. So WIN, as Dean Olian had mentioned, is Women in Institutional Investments Network. And so we're really a community to empower, inspire, and educate women in institutional investments, specifically here in Southern California. So we've grown to over 200 members, as she mentioned, and we're thrilled that we have 16 corporate sponsors. So we continue to grow, and thank you for your support. So this is really special collaboration between our two organizations this evening, and we have quite a panel for you this evening with quite different and diverse perspectives on the industry. We look forward to hearing more about their experiences, including how they got to where they are today, some of the challenges and accomplishments along the way in running a firm, and how their firms are positioned today. So our first panelist is actually Becky Gratzinger. She is CEO and Senior Consultant and Principal at RVK, which is a consulting firm up in Portland. So thank you for coming down to join us today.
Absolutely.
Jane Buchan is CEO and Managing Director at PAMCO, which is an investment firm focused on alternative solutions for investors. And then finally, Sarah Ketterer is CEO and portfolio manager, both fundamental portfolio manager, and works on the absolute return strategies and investment research across all strategies at Causeway Capital. So thank you for joining us this evening. Last but not least, we have Professor Andrea Eisfeld. So she has been, she's the Fink Endowed Chair, as we mentioned, in finance and has been a professor since 2000. She previously spent 2 years as a chief economist at Structured Portfolio Management, a fixed income and mortgage-backed securities hedge fund in Connecticut, so has industry experience as well. And she's currently doing some consulting at AQR. So thank you so much. I left this room inspired and empowered 6 years ago, and I hope you do the same tonight. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Laura. I just wanted to get right down into it. We had a brief introduction of everyone's careers and positions. I think everyone here wants to learn a little bit about the path to how you got where you are. When my son learns about writing stories, they talk about a watermelon and starting with a seed. So if there are any particular seeds in your road to where you got, we would love to hear about those. So Becky, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, my path's probably non-standard. If there is a standard path, I'd be interested to hear about it. But I started in high tech right after I got my finance degree from college. And actually, college was an interesting experience because I was one of those kids in high school that loved everything, from music to math. And so I started in school actually enrolling in pharmacy. And then by the time I actually got on campus, changed to music education, then added mathematical sciences on top of that. And between my sophomore and junior year, I thought, now I've got to get serious and figure out what I'm going to do with these two sides of myself, education and being with people, as well as a love of the sciences. I went through the syllabus, actually through the list of majors, and found music, and thought, I'm not really wired to be a performance major, although I've played piano all my life. And I don't want to be stuck in a back room doing just science or pure math. So business just jumped out of the catalog. I enrolled, I loved every minute of it. It was easy from day one. And of course, I realized I'd taken too many calculus courses. But in terms of how I got started in my career, I started at Tektronix. So I started in high tech, and my first job was extending credit and then first actually collecting bills, which was no fun at all. But I prided myself in an approach that never involved yelling at a client and caught a little attention because I was able to collect as much of those old bills as the folks that did yell. So I advanced out of that position very quickly in a year and then managed the cash and debt book really for Tektronix for the whole company as a 25-year-old. So I was very lucky in that I came to a company when it was downsizing and I kept volunteering. So I got a chance to do things very early in my career and work directly with senior management at Tektronix when it was a global firm. And the interesting, ironic thing is that I still work for Tektronix, in that when Danaher bought them and when I joined RVK a few years after starting my career at Tech, I was able to keep touch with my original employer as a consultant to their pension plans. So it's a very small world. While I was at Tektronix, I was thinking about a career outside of corporate finance and started my CFA program and thought, aha, this is what I want to do. So I fell into consulting, literally. I answered a blind ad in the local paper for a 401k communications specialist, was doing 401k videos for RVK for 6 months, not in front of the camera videos, basically PowerPoints with my voice. Clients complained that the voice on the videos was high-pitched and whiny. So I knew that any of my performance major dreams of being in voice were absolutely not going to work. So actually, when we figured out that the mutual fund industry was giving videos away, then I just started working with our corporate clients, and from there worked with our public fund clients, and the rest is history. So I joined RVK in '94, started shadowing our founder immediately, and went through various analysis of how to grow the firm with him. Eventually, with a number of shareholders, bought the firm out from that founder in 2010, was made CEO prior to that in 2008. So consulting is absolutely my passion. I found what I love to do, and I found out what I wanted to do in 1994, and I wouldn't be anywhere else.
Thank you so much. So I think for this one, we'll just go down the road. Jane, if you want to take it.
Okay, so I'm a little different than Becky. I wanted to be in the back room, hidden away. So my life is, I was always pretty good, and I'm old, and so when they started computers, like I learned on cards and mainframes and things like Fortran, so don't worry about it. I can't make my iPhone work. Don't you hate that upgrade? Anyway, so I went to college. I actually grew up in Oregon. I went to college back east, and majored in all sorts of weird things. Took a lot of different random classes. Essentially majored in random studies would be a good way to think about it. my college basically didn't have requirements to get a degree. If you paid 4 years of tuition, they gave you a degree. Or my father paid 4 years of tuition, they gave you a degree. But anyway, a lot of my classmates were big investment banking. This is in the 80s, early 80s. And Wall Street's taking off. And the professor who had kind of agreed to advise me on my senior project was really hard on me, which was really good. And he looked at me and he said, "You're nerdy, so I'm going to challenge you to do an event study, and you got to do it yourself and figure this out and meet with me just a few times, and this is what we're going to do." And I was always willing to jump in the deep end. Sometimes I drowned, but I survived. And I remember the still look on his face when he asked me around Christmas time, "So what are you going to do?" And being from Oregon, which is, pardon me, Hicksville, and not understanding how the dynamic went, I launched into a 15-minute diatribe about the evils of investment banking. Minus this is a huge finance professor. So I still remember quite his face when he just said, "But Jane, there are a few other jobs in finance." And I hadn't really thought about it. So he hooked me up with a former Wharton professor who was actually working in the real world, and I kind of worked as his graduate student. So I got a real paycheck, unlike academia, but I got to learn a lot of finance. And that's how I fell into it. And so I didn't even know what basically a stock or a bond was when I went there. I wasn't trained in that. And it was through learning and having a really, really good foundational experience there, learning a lot of just basic finance. That's how I did that. And so I did that, and then growing up in Oregon, our state religion is track and field.
The Church of Nike.
The Church of Nike, yes. So shocking, after I graduated, after doing this for working at JP Morgan Investment Management in New York, JPM, what a great name for an asset management firm. I think they changed it to JP Morgan Asset Management because of that. But anyway, so I got an offer to jump for Nike. I was a pretty good athlete, trained for the Olympic trials, and moved out to Southern California, which is how I got out here. And because I ended up in a firm full of a lot of Graham and Dodd people, and I still can't read a balance sheet statement, which is a problematic being a CEO. Is there money in the bank? And talk to your CFO to figure that out. But what I could do is, because I knew how to do a lot of mathematics and a lot of what you call modern finance, I got dragged into stuff very, very early. Ended up writing a bunch of software for asset liability management. I read actuarial books to write actuarial stuff when that change came in. I met with a lot of early hedge funds. I did a lot of principal component. I did a lot of very technical stuff, and went to the Olympic trials, totally didn't make the team, which I wasn't supposed to make the team, but I was the only one with a half real job. And then I decided I want to go back to grad school. So I went back to grad school, very fixated on learning more and more, and had a great grad school experience, and then ended up teaching. But I continued the affiliation with the company out here. And then what I ended up doing is I was in the classroom back in New Hampshire, Monday morning teaching, out here for dinner. We only had one car, so my husband had to drive me to Manchester, an hour away, to fly out here for dinner. Red eye back in the classroom in Hanover, New Hampshire, Tuesday morning, and out here again for dinner. And I said, my husband has just retired as a international class track and field athlete, and he has no job, and I have two, and there's something wrong. And so I left the tenure track and just went to the real world, and then ended up being out here full-time with a firm that I'd left a decade before, realizing the firm there's a big difference working 2,500 miles away, showing up periodically for dinners versus being there every day. And some clients said, why don't you leave and we'll follow you? And so that's what we ended up doing. And so that's how totally random.
And fun.
Sorry.
Well, take it away, Sarah.
Laura Clark mentioned how meaningful this room was to her, the last time I was here, about 2 years ago, I spoke to a group of MBAs about this. I chose this topic, the 2008 global financial crisis. Well, it was so depressing. Practically everybody walked out, so I set a very low bar for myself. After college, I decided I needed to go to investment banking, so I went to work for. I did a lot of that. And it's wonderful because you learn valuations. You really want to dive into finance, and at the time it was all male. And my boss didn't hire me. It was the two guys who hired me went off like 3 weeks later and started a very successful private equity business, abandoning me, leaving me with a boss who didn't believe women should be working. It was a problem. So for 2 years, I had to keep impressing him. I worked so hard. Friends, weddings, I didn't do anything. I was always in the office. But he wrote me these miserly recommendations for business school. I got into a wonderful place, the same place that Jane taught, Dartmouth. Not as good as UCLA, but very good. And so just to, like the last day of work, before I was to leave and go off, I had a couple weeks to pack and go off to business school, I went to a pet store and I bought about 300 live crickets. And I got into the office about 3 a.m. It's cold, it's dark. I put them in all the potted plants. As the sun rose and the heat began to emanate from the office, well, needless to say, I laughed so hard. And that really took me, it gave me a tailwind to business school. So after business school, I went back to investment banking because I certainly hadn't had enough. And after 3 years of that, I really did have a great toolkit by then. I had done cross-border work. I represented European companies, U.S. companies, looked at various types of international accounting. The world hadn't really gotten to international accounting to a sort of homogenous level, so there's lots of disparity. And I began to notice this, and I really didn't like the transaction business. You kind of know if you're an investor because the transaction business rubs you the wrong way. It's too cursory and it's too temporary. So I knew I was going to leave, but I wanted to go to something. You never really want to leave. You want to always go to something. And decided to start a database business because I saw all these different types of. We were buying a little data here and a little data there, and there was nothing really good. The giants like Morgan Stanley Capital International, MSCI. You may have heard of them. Huge database business. It's a wonderful cash cow business if you can get it going. It just requires a bit of money up front, of which I had none. So I left the firm I was working for and started this with a partner. And I was living in New York City, which is like having a vacuum cleaner in your wallet. So I lasted about 3 months before I realized I was going to be broke. I was literally going to my closet and reaching my hand into the pockets of coats to see if I'd left any coins in there. It was sort of sad. But didn't deter me, so I rang up the first person I could think of who had money, my father. Yeah, I had really sunk to a low point by then. It's okay though. He had a domestic U.S. equity and some fixed income, thriving money management business here in Los Angeles. And I said, look, I've got data and I need to sell it to somebody. And he said, well, we're thinking about starting international equity. You want to come take a look and maybe you can give us some consulting help. And I said, does it pay? So I was off on a plane and I did begin to do a little consulting. I had never before thought about being an investor rather than being a banker, but the transition was really easy because, first of all, I was unmarried, I had no children, so I could literally live the job. I went on the trade desks all over the globe to understand from a sell side perspective what they were trying to do to the buy side, and that was a fascinating experience. And armed with that and understanding better, I knew a lot about data by then, as you might imagine. So crafting a strategy that was multi-currency was, it wasn't easy, but it was doable. The only problem was when you work for a relative, at least in my case, this anti-nepotism effort put me behind literally a vault door. I didn't even see the rest of the firm. I was in a closet. So it took a while before I recognized I needed more colleagues. Working alone doesn't get you very far, very long. So we'd had a couple of domestic equity clients say, all right, they were literally cajoled, fund our international equity effort. And so there was a bit of money to manage, but I needed.
Just going to switch out your mic real
Oh, sure.
quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Needed manpower. And that's when I met my current business partner, Harry Hartford, who was working and living in Dublin, Ireland. And convincing somebody from Dublin to move to Los Angeles doesn't take very long. Believe me. And then we worked together to build the business up, and a few years later, Merrill Lynch bought the entire company. Neither of us were partners, so we were on a 5-year employment contract, a bit like indentured servitude. But it worked out okay because they were a very generous employer and helped us. They signed a lot of checks for us. We hired a number of people. But after 5 more years, they were anxious. Large broker-dealer firms with that type of mentality, even if they think they understand the asset management world, they often don't. It's really hard for them. It's culturally completely different. So after making another large acquisition in asset management, they decided to sell it. The firm they just bought, the one I was working for 5 years prior, and that was a problem. Imagine going to your clients to whom you've said, this first acquisition is good for you, we're all fine here, everybody's in place, and then just a few years later having to say, oh, now we're going to be owned by somebody else who happens to be a growth manager and we're a value manager. And oh, by the way, we will have no salespeople here at Los Angeles, they'll all be in Denver. I couldn't do that. So that was really the genesis of Causeway. In 2001, we formed our firm with 24 people. We took everybody out of, the whole international equity effort literally just eviscerated it from the parent company and then replanted it in closer to where I live. What the heck? I don't, at that time I had 3 children, and so it was a little challenging driving downtown. And it was a little scary. We lost money for 3 years. When you start something, you have to be committed because it is always harder than you think. And and my business partner, Harry, and I had to lend the business money to keep paying everybody's salary. It got to be very interesting, as they say. But thankfully, as often happens, we had the great fortune of good timing. The strategy we were using was producing quite good performance. And as a result, the clients began to come back. So we attracted back almost all of our former clients. They all eventually signed up. And then what happens is after you manage their money for 3 months, you send them a bill, and they take 3 or maybe 6 months to pay you. But the unfortunate bit here is that you pay both Uncle Sam and the state of California right up front because you're showing net income. You just have no cash flow, none. In fact, it's all going out the door. So that's why I was a little, I'd say, uncomfortable for a while. We had a seed investor, which helped to give us additional capital. But it was the most terrifying and the most exciting time of my life thus far, and I would recommend it highly.
That was a really fun tour. So many follow-up questions, but one thing I was thinking about, because I think we have a lot of accomplished women in the room, but I feel like there's that, everyone faces in so many problems, the last mile problem or the glass ceiling or whatever you want to call it. And it sounds like you guys handled that problem or challenge if it came up to you in different ways, but I heard a lot of people saying, I went and started my own thing. So just wanted you guys to maybe comment on, what to do to get to the last level. I think once you come and get your MBA or you're out and you're an MD or wherever you are, you're almost there. How do you get to the next level?
Keep pushing. That's what I found when I was in the high-tech world. My boss, the treasurer, came to me and she said, I am going to make you aggressive. And I'm looking at her saying, I'm not an aggressive person. She said, obviously, that's why I'm going to make you aggressive. And it was interesting because she had quite the reputation being in a man's high-tech world in the 90s and 80s. Interestingly, she came from a ranching family where the women were the foremen. And so that she'd gotten the practical application of how to work in that kind of environment. So her advice would be smash any ceiling you come up against. And that's basically my attitude. Is I have literally very few times felt like there was a ceiling that I had to crash through up, but I never hesitated when it was there. And some of the ceilings that I felt were subtle and some weren't. One of them, which was surprising, a few of my clients told me that they had heard that I was our founder's daughter. Oh my goodness, that, talking about setting you back, mentally thinking, no, I didn't get here for that reason. I got here because I learned everything about the business, I learned how the decisions were made, I got the trust of the people that I work with, and grabbed the opportunity. And so it was one of those situations where you do whatever it takes to get to that next level, but don't settle for anything less than the level you want to strive for.
Did you know you were going to get to the very top when you started?
No. Actually, I didn't know what investment consulting was till in Tektronix I was learning to be cross-trained to actually work in the DB and the DC plan and support that effort. So when I started, no, it was just a new application for all the things I just learned in my CFA and all the practical on-the-job learning that I'd had in corporate finance. But once I saw what it took to become a CEO, it was just natural because it was the intersection of all the things that I loved. Leadership, the ability to teach people, the ability to help clients. It was everything I loved, and some of the things, that when you talk about financing a business or leading people through hard times, those are the times when you realize it's time to put to work the lessons you learned being an employee. And so I always try to apply that and remember what it was like for me and bring those folks alongside me rather than looking back to see where they are, make sure they're part of those decisions. And that's a big challenge for a CEO. To lead, but yet be part of your team.
Yeah, management is a whole nother can of worms relative to finance, which I found out when I went into the private sector. And I also like being in the back room. So, Jane, have you smashed anything in your career?
Is that literally or metaphorically? Yes and yes.
Either.
No, I mean, a couple of things. One of the advantages of owning your own business is you can kind of spend the money what you want. And having served a few years as a professor, we have a lot of friends who are professors, and so we give them money to do research projects just because that's fun. And one of the really depressing ones that just got done by two friends, or a colleague and another friend of mine, dealt with, which just got published in a decent refereed journal, has to look at women in hedge funds. So I come out of the hedge fund space, and one of the good things, it was funny when Raj and Nicole did this, they called me and they were going through some of the early results, and with me and one of my partners, Judy, and they were like, well, we have really bad things to show you because we questioned some of the data that are out there about women running hedge funds. Just don't think it's good or good data. And so they went back and really redid a rigorous analysis, and they called and said, there's no difference between the way girls and boys run money. And it was funny because they were apologetic. Judy and I are like doing high fives. Yay! There's no difference between us. We're just people. We're trained investors. We love this. And then came the really thing that they thought was really trivial that really depressed Judy and myself, which was, but the women have to do substantially better to raise the same amount of money. And I think that's really true. And, I've been very fortunate, lucky, whatever, that I've had some really, really, really nice people who have done nice things. So when I did my really technical finance work in graduate school, there were approximately 40, 38, 41, 42, whatever people in the class. I was the only girl. And you could tell that everyone was like, what's she doing in here? And I did okay in the rest of the class, but I really knocked the socks off on the first exam. You know, go out the gate. I'm a sprinter, go out early, fast. And it was a very prominent professor, Nobel laureate, who's teaching the class. And, you know, he kind of, I think he went into parent mode and read the dynamics of the room. And it was the only time he ever passed back exams this way. But he came back and, you know, probably, I'm going to guess 70% of the class were math PhD students and stuff, and foreign males, and, well, everyone except me was a male. But, and he said, he went up to the class and he said, "Jane, congratulations, you got the best score." And that just changed a lot. And so I've had some really nice things happen. Conversely, I've also been publicly raked over the coals and stuff. Been accused of the only reason PAMCO's good is because I'm a girl. You know, we've never taken a dime set aside money. So, you know, you live by the sword and die by the sword. And so, you know, I'd love to paint a very, what I call happy picture, but I do go back to the day. The reality is, I think on average it's harder, and you just should be prepared for that and not get discouraged. It's doable. It's very, very doable. And I'm very worried because the gains that we've all made are going backwards now, because if you look at the pipeline problem, there are not a lot of young women in the 20s who are in the right line jobs to end up in these seats. And I'm very worried about it. And I wish I could find a way to have a better conversation about the fact that, heck, girls and boys perform the same, but girls have to do so much better to get the same assets. And I think that's just, I don't know, sort of going off on the end, but that's a big issue for us.
My advice, some of you may be students, but most of you are already professionally in this industry, is use your gender to your advantage. Having started a business, any client we could get who wanted a female-owned business, we were just barely female-owned, like 50.032. I mean, it was debatable. And I'm hoping as the year goes by, even though as a sort of senior generation at my firm, my equity slowly and surely gets diluted, goes into the hands of my colleagues, which is how you perpetuate a great employee-owned investment management firm, that my junior colleagues who are female, who are here today or tonight, end up being much greater owners, because it is a tremendous advantage not only to have really bright, talented women in your investment team, but to have them as part of the ownership. There are many clients out there who are looking for that. So why not use it? Use every advantage you can get. And then for the Middle Eastern trips, I just don't go.
So I guess we can turn a little bit, and I'll let you decide what you want to answer, and maybe we can start with you, Sarah, for this one. If you want to tell us, kind of about any important outside interests. We heard about Olympics and and world travel that have been influential, or something about the current economic landscape and things that your team is thinking about, or things that clients are asking about.
I think two questions are very quickly. Outside interests, I always want to know what my clients are thinking, and they're never going to tell me exactly. So if you can get on some sort of charitable board, or in some way be on a finance committee, one of these boards, and then evaluate investment managers, try to reverse those roles. You will find that is incredibly interesting and insightful. You get to work with talented consultants or an outsourced CIO and meet managers, and it adds that perspective. Over time, we tend to get narrower and narrower and the head buried in the sand. So I would encourage you, if you can do something charitable, really get involved and then make it synergistic with your work, so that I'm sure you all have the same issue, like every time you're not working, or if you're not with family, there's a giant opportunity cost. So make sure it's something that's really productive. I didn't want to talk about the economy, so I just
Okay, Jane, we'll just come back this way. You want to talk about the economy or outside interests? or do they intersect?
Too much, too complex for me. No, one of my partners, Putri's here, wonderful. She's so good. You see her on TV. She's just like amazing. It's envious. One of the things that's I think is important, kind of on the economy, and I don't know, and I'd go a little bit. I actually want to ask this question of Sarah and Becky. Is I think it's hard to make generalizations. Girls tend to be shorter than boys. I'm taller than a lot of guys. But I think women tend to lead differently. And I think we're more collegial and we're more cooperative. Now again, I'm sure there are lots of women that are just terrors and there's lots of boys who are good. But when you talk about the mean of a distribution, I think that's different. And I think if you think about the challenges of where asset management's going, which is information edges are virtually disappearing. So, I mean, when we all started, I mean, getting data was that's how you start. I mean, getting data was a big part of it. And now you just type things in and it's there. I mean, people rent time on satellites and count the number of cars in Walmarts. I'm not joking. And so what really matters now is thinking about the data, which, at least myself, I always have, you get going in one direction, you have tunnel vision, and so you need people where you can be respectful and challenge each other. And I think as women, we're more, on average, more inclined to lead in a more, what I call collegial manner rather than, and I think that's, particularly if you join an organization, I'll follow up on what Sarah said, because I think what she said is so important, get involved in something you really love, like a board and stuff. But if you do that, understand that there may be some differences in the dynamics because you're there. I mean, do you think you lead differently?
I spent years just collecting best and worst practices, and I try not to implement the worst, but they often came from poor male bosses who had no idea, no idea how to gain consensus, no idea that people are obsessed with relatives. You just have to be paying attention to notice it's not absolute gains. People are to really motivate a group, you've got to make sure that they know how they're doing relative to each other. That's the yardstick they all use. And then this idea of motivation, encouragement. I never worked for any male boss who was really good at that. It was just like, hey, maybe it's all the grunts. You got to tell people. If they're doing well, you got to tell them. And if they're not, you have to tell them. And so communicating is critical. It's not much more difficult than that. It just, many people don't do it well.
Becky, would you like to add something before we open it up for questions? I think this is great because it's like the one piece of advice, that you would give someone from your experience. So.
Sure. One of the things I keep telling folks that are growing through our organization is active listening is an absolutely critical skill in every situation. It's not only having the mastery of our craft, whatever it is, but it's the ability to communicate that in a way that's appropriate for that audience. And that's where the education of me, the education part of me comes through. And I think women do that much better. And I think the other element that I know I find very valuable is you see all kinds of books written about emotional intelligence. It's incredibly important as well. Whenever you're trying to communicate to someone, being able to do it in a way that's relevant for that board, for that individual is incredibly important. And I think to the point of personal interests, it is very important to lead a life that is both interesting to yourself and rewarding to yourself, but also to the people that you are surrounding yourself with. And being able to have something in common, no matter how small, is something my dad, the engineer, used to instill in me. Remember something key. So when I look at all the things that I love to do outside of work, they make me better at work. whether it's running, whether it's the horses that I have, whether it's music, architecture. I've got 1,000 things that I love to do, and I think that makes me better at my job, because at the core of what we do as women and leaders is you have to be the person that the folks that work with you want to be someday. And one of the things I learned about one of my early bosses is that person had 3 interests in life. That was a very, very narrow person in my view. And in a rich investment committee setting, if they weren't talking about those 3 topics, that was very difficult. And I absolutely committed that I would never be a person with only 3 facets. And so that's something that I think is a really big piece of advice as you're building this fabulous career. Make sure that you are a great human being at the same time.
It's really interesting, and I do wonder if that's more of a female characteristic. It's true when I think about who I want to be. You look up and you want to be someone, usually not someone who's singularly focused only on work. And I just don't know if that's a difference between men and women, whether they can look at it and say, that's all I want or not. But I really want to open it up to questions at this point. I'm sure we have a lot of great questions from the audience. So we're just going to ask that you raise your hand, and then we're going to bring a microphone over to you.
I want to know if you feel satisfied. And Becky, you answered that question a little bit, but just in general in your life, and if not, what would help you feel satisfied?
Having done a few different things in my life, what I really like to do is be intensely committed to them. That's like part of being the level of athlete I was. And just to give you a sense, what I love about my work is that we've got 7 offices around the globe, and I was on the phone at 10:30 last night, 2:30 this morning with Hong Kong, in the office at 5:30. I like living in the asset management world, so I like being very singular. And so it works for me.
Sarah? Satisfied?
Yeah, very. Yeah, I remember the question. I was just trying to think of the answer. It took me a long time to figure out. I was working so hard, I actually failed for years to stop and think, what do I really enjoy doing? I was just doing. And when I got into the world of asset management, and then I kind of combined it with having a family and then growing a business, I realized I like to build things. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. Is I've built this incredible family. I've got a kid who graduated from college and has a job. It is amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. She just blows me away. So, and the business is changing, and it gets more challenging, more competitive, and fee pressure, and I love that because there's so much to do, and there's so much more building and growing ahead. So I'm very satisfied.
Becky?
I am, but I'm not satisfied with, I'm satisfied in that I love what I do, but I love solving problems. And so you never get to the top of that run, right? Every client you meet with has a different set of issues, whether it's they didn't contribute to their pension plan for decades, or whether they're overspending and they're an endowment, or they have a tough time hanging on to active managers successfully and being able to be rewarded with the returns that you are able to experience by living through market cycles. So the satisfying part for me is being part of solving a problem for a client or a firm.
Hi, I just had a question as far as when you looking back at your career, did you have a mentor that stood out in your life? And if so, was it a man or was it a woman?
Well, mine were all men, and there were a series of them, just inspiring, good leaders, people who were willing to take me under their wing, but they were all men because I only worked with men for years. I didn't really have that many choices. But I would have liked to have had a female mentor, very much so. They just weren't around.
Becky?
I didn't, other than the first example I gave you in my first job, which is the person who's going to make me aggressive. But that's the other thing that it has been very hard to find role models, and I don't know that I actually can point to one. Most of them have been men, but I'm hoping I can resolve that for the next generation.
Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I've had three academics and one business person who've been huge mentors to me, been very nice to me, and they're all been guys. But we're all sort of a generation where there really weren't a lot of women in front of us. And again, that's why I worry about the pipeline issue, is that if we don't keep growing people in asset management, and that's why I'm so excited about, we're all so excited about WIN, because it's so easy to reverse the gains, and then you're reliving. I mean, it's just like the generation that came in front of us paid a very steep price that allowed us to climb where we are. It's just, we've got to keep moving.
So I was just wondering, as you were all speaking, that you're executives, and as far as you've come in your career, you've had to make so many decisions. And every day you're bombarded with really minor decisions that could affect the company. And how do you take all this information and decide that something needs to be spent more time on? Like, what's the toughest decision that you've had to make in business, and how did you come to that decision? Becky, do you want to take that one first?
There's been a couple. One is, joining a firm that was started by an entrepreneur and recognizing when we were at a growth inflection point and what it would take to get to the next level, and going through that buyout activity. That was the hardest thing, I would say, just because with entrepreneurial firms, it's easy to just go along with that path, and then when the entrepreneur is no longer interested or wants to sell, then sometimes the firm doesn't become what it could under a different management structure. So that was a very, very difficult decision, but the right decision. And do you know it when it's right in front of you? Yeah, that one I did. But there's been many other decisions where you walk in the door and find that there is something that is firm changing that you are facing that you didn't expect. And one of the things I've learned is, if you've surrounded yourself with people that you trust, you listen to them, but then you make a decision. And it may not be what they tell you, but they're all going to be part of the answer for that particular situation.
There are a lot of hard decisions. So it was interesting this morning when one of my colleagues, the guy who sits next to me, came into my office and said a really nice thing. He said, "Geez, I really feel sorry for you. Your job's so lonely." And no, I'm serious. And one of the things that I think is important, and I want to talk for 1 second about this, is that sitting in the CEO seat is a very, very lonely place, because you can't talk to, there's a lot of things that you just can't talk to people about. And different firms handle it differently. We have a partnership, but still, they're still really, and I think what's important for women is to think about being in what I call the C-suite, because there's a lot of really powerful jobs like chief investment officer, chief operating officer, CFO, head of client service, that are all like C-level jobs. And I think where I've seen some bad things are where people aim for a job and they don't realize that there's certain consequences and characteristics of it. And so that's important. The things that really bother me aren't the big crushing business things. Those are fun and exciting, kind of the business decisions. We don't make too many of them, but when they come along, what do you want to do? Do you want to take over something? Someone wants to sell you something or do something for you. The really hard ones to me are where they're really like crushing personal circumstances, but you also have firm equity issues, HR issues to deal with. And those are really, really soul taxing. And those are very hard because you can't really talk with anybody about them. And so those are really, really hard places.
There's really only one decision that I find challenging. The rest of them, who cares? And it's people. It's an asset management business, is people. It's hiring the right people. And I have just anecdotally, I'm going to be deposed tomorrow for the second time. Same deposition, they didn't finish the last time. And this is all due to a poor hiring choice that I take responsibility for. A former head of our sales, marketing, and client service, who I knew was incompetent, but I was just this bit about being non-confrontational can get you into terrible trouble. Like, if you don't deal with it right away, it will get worse and worse and worse, and that cancer will spread throughout your organization and literally take the motivation out of colleagues. So now I pay for it. It's just extra time I have to spend getting rid of this guy. We let him go, and then he decided to sue us for wrongful termination. By the way, this is the land of grown-ups. When you get sued, you know you finally have a real firm. So to the extent you're ever in a position where you're doing hiring, it's a part science and part intuition, and I have hired people that my colleagues didn't necessarily agree on, but I was convinced through experience and just a gut that that was the right decision. But my senses are also absolutely spot on when it comes to somebody who's not working out, and the key is to end that relationship right away and not put it off. You only have to learn that lesson once.
What are you all doing within your organizations and across the industry to change that 2% that you're part of?
Well, Jane and I are both West Coast Advisory Board members of a really remarkable organization, and I never thought that I'd be we hired, just another anecdote, this past summer, a rising sophomore in college in a program called Girls Who Invest. And it was founded by a former client of mine who knows Jane and other women, and she's literally created this network across the country identifying young women. They're in college, they don't know anything about asset management, think they'd like to try, and they're trained on the Penn campus for 4 weeks and then put out in internships. There were about 30 last summer, there'll be 60 this coming summer. But Jane commented, like the 20-year-olds, somebody has to get to these young women. In case, I think the one we hired was barely 20, and wide-eyed, and she was a great contributor in her 6-week internship. But we won't be able to hire her for a long time. I'll be in a wheelchair by the time she's hireable. So it was a little bit charitable, but on the other hand, we have to do it. We women have to get to these really young women and educate them and let them know this is a great business to be in.
We have 19 partners in our firm. A third are women, and most of them are in line portfolio management positions, not in support positions. And so I've been told by people in the media that we're one of the largest firms in terms of multi-partners with a really large contingent. I'll have to tell a story. We've got several people, Danielle and stuff here, so they'll all know who we're talking about. So please don't give it all away. But a few years ago, more than a few years ago, we hire a lot of people out of Anderson and other MBAs, and I mean, it's a very demanding job. And we needed someone to move to the London office. And I went in and talked to this woman and, got my spiel ready. My 10-minute spiel, I'm gonna, my best sales hat on, why you want to go to London. And I got like 4 minutes into it. She looked at me, she says, I'll do it. And then she said, wait a second. I need to call my husband, pretend I'm consulting with him, and I'll get back to you in half an hour. And I said, you go. And I just loved it because that's exactly what the guys do when I ask them to go to London. So, or Singapore or other offices. So, I mean, that to me is just really fabulous. Where we fall down as a firm, and I hit us over the head and I try to rectify it, is while we have done personally well as a firm, we are a fund of hedge funds, so we hire a lot of managers. We have not done as good a job out in hiring the hedge fund managers. Mm-hmm. And so I take my baseball bat occasionally, you said break things, and go after some of the guys, and I will continue to do that.
Fantastic. Becky?
Active mentoring is something that I think is really critical, and not just the mentoring programs that are written up that people follow and say, okay, I need to meet with this person 4 times a year, this is what we need to talk about, but finding real situations to mentor folks on the job. The thing that was really shocking to me this year is I actually had an employee who's also a female, who's also very accomplished, come up to me and say, you know what, you intimidate me. I thought, oh my goodness, what in the heck is going on here? Because one of the things that I really pride myself on is being very approachable. So that taught me what I need to do is not assume that people know I'm approachable, just make it happen. Just do the active outreach to make sure that they know that.
Well, this is kind of related to family building, and while building family, if you choose to do so, maintaining a career. I've had a 15 years of international career, and I have 2 kids under 3 now, and kind of faced with some certain dilemmas. And I'm just wondering if you guys had similar experiences as you're raising kids, if you have children. Or if you had to mentor some women who were faced with those difficult times in the first couple of years of childhood, and how they maintain success in both realms.
So I think this is something that we definitely had to touch on. I was going to take a survey. Actually, how many of your husbands also work?
Second husband. Oh, I love this. I love this.
I remember when I first came to Anderson and someone said that the most important decision that you make in your career as a woman is who your husband is going to be if you have one. And I really think that is key, and that is kind of an interesting thing to talk about. But Jane, go ahead. How do you balance work and family?
Do husbands count as kids? So the answer is I either don't have children or I have a big one. No, my husband, the reality is my husband was a world-class track and field athlete, is a coach, very, very committed. I mean, his practice at 7 a.m. 6 days a week. So, I mean, his hours are very intense all the way through till 5 or 6 o'clock, 6 days a week. But he's not in a position that if something needs to happen, he can not show up for, he can kind of not show up for a day. I couldn't do the job I do with the schedule I have, given my personality. Like sometimes forgetting to tell him as I walk out the door that I'm going to New York and we'll be back in 3 days. Where are you? I've got dinner on the table. Oops, I'm in New York. So I couldn't do what I do with kids, and so he coaches, and so that's how we have surrogate children.
Becky?
I don't have kids, but it wasn't a decision because of my career. It was a conviction as a person that I'm put on this planet to help people with their kids. So I've got about 10 kids I can count as surrogate kids, which are amazing. But one of the real pleasures that I have is reaching out to women in our firm who choose to become moms and assure them that I think that is an amazing decision, and whatever we're going to do, we're going to do whatever it takes to make it possible to do both, because we value that. So I want to make sure they don't take away from my decision the impression that it takes not having kids to be successful. I want them to have confidence in that decision.
Sarah?
Well, I think I have enough for all of you. I have 5. Well, I had 3, and then I married, second marriage, so that brought another, and then I had another after that with a sort of a long story, but you don't have to. It's really by far the most difficult thing I've ever had to do is raise the kids, devote time to them, be physically and mentally present for them, and do the same thing on the job and still sleep. It's near impossible, and every day you fight to get it done. But it's, again, back to being satisfied, it has made me very satisfied.
I guess a question on management style, twofold. You've kind of alluded to this, Becky, but being the balance of collegial and approachable, but also providing that tough love and that stern force that's needed, I imagine, at your level particularly. How do you find that balance? And then I guess my second part of the question is, how do you manage and also work with people that have very different skill sets, and let's say gender differences maybe have different skill sets, and kind of, I guess taking some of the things that you really pride yourself on and encouraging some of your other employees or male employees to have those same, I guess, techniques in the job. Anything on those would be helpful.
Becky, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. So management style is really an interesting question. One of the things I remember talking to our founder about when I'd get to be CEO, it was always, well, 5 years from now, 4 years from now, maybe 10 years from now. But one of the things that he said that he was absolutely right about is you've got to have a really strong management team. And that is something that's critical for me because my passion is being in front of clients and being very involved in that as well as running the firm. And so it is a team effort. The term "it takes a village," that's true, but you have to have leadership at the top of that village. And so my balancing the management job is making sure no matter how confident I am about what should be done in a certain part of the business, is to try to empower the managers to be able to make the decisions they need to, but to know when they're to that point where they have to cross the line of getting further approval. So for me, it's all about getting a great management team. And the management style is collegial, but at the end of the day, the buck stops at the top and you have to make those decisions. And the other thing that I think sometimes women get criticized about is people think we need to make everyone happy. Not true. And that's very hard to realize, that making the right decision doesn't mean that that's going to happen.
Thank you. Jane?
I think getting back to the earlier point that there are a lot of C-level jobs, at least in my experience, and I'm curious if it's true for you, Becky, and you, Sarah, but you can kind of have a distinct management style, at least in my experience, if you run operations or you run investments or you run whatever. The problem with CEOs, you got to interface with all these different groups, and you really have to conform yourself to what they need, not what you need. And so sitting in that nexus, you have to be really super elastic. And what you have to do is it's not what you want as CEO, it's what that person needs from you to do a better job at their job. I mean, you almost become like the supermarket or whatever. You're there, they're reaching into you to satisfy things. And so don't put yourself in the middle of a general management position if you don't want to accommodate yourself to the people around you. Be in a technical area if you want to run things your way. That's a really important distinction. I don't think people communicate in business schools. The second thing I think it's very important is you also need, I really enjoyed your comment about being intimidating. I don't think of myself as intimidating, but people say the same thing. It's like sort of where's it coming from? But I do think, I mean, it's to Sarah's point, there are times you have to be pretty hard, pretty heavy, pretty fast. And the fact that you can reach into that toolkit, which a lot of people aren't comfortable doing in a rational way, is really important on doing things. And the last big piece of advice I got from one of my mentors is, he said, Jane, if you're working with somebody, realize as long as they're going in the right direction, that's what matters. So if they're a 2 in something, just try to get them to a 3. Don't try to make them a 10. And you can't change people. People can change themselves if they want to, but you can't change people, and you have to accept that.
So, yeah.
And the point about, as the CEO, our job is to help others do their job better. I can't emphasize that enough. I have just anecdotally a weekly call with our head of intermediary distribution, which is mostly mutual fund sales. And we started this about 2 years ago, and he will call every week nervous that I'm going to criticize him, and there's not enough in the pipeline. But slowly but surely he's realizing that I'm listening. I'm trying to figure out what he needs to do his job better. Is there a problem with legal? Or is something stuck in operations? Are we trying to form a new investment vehicle, but there's a problem with it? How can I be helpful? And that has brought a lot of loyalty and created this great virtuous cycle of a much more cooperative, much more energized colleague.
I think that's really interesting. There was definitely a theme there about, as a CEO, think of the job as how can you help how can you help the people below you get where they're trying to go, rather than how can they help you get the
Right.
firm where you want it to go?
Right.
Yeah.
So I know we just talked about management style, but I just want to take the question a step further and ask about if you consider yourself a leader, and if so, what is kind of something that you're conscious of in your day-to-day, or a principle that you live by to lead and to inspire people to follow you, and not like literally follow you, but want to work for you and want to engage with you and want to be supportive of you and partner with you?
I can't ask people to do something I won't do. That's the number one. And if I haven't been on a research trip, or I haven't actually looked at the presentation and thought about it carefully and responded with some questions, then how can I ask them to put in the hours and the time and the thought? So if you're going to lead, you have to lead by example.
Jane?
I mean, I've got several of my colleagues and partners here. I think I'm a pretty strong leader, and I interpret leader as saying kind of the vision and where we're going. I'm a crappy manager. I've got a fabulous management team. And those are very different skills, and it's important to not confuse those skills. So
What is a management team?
all the department heads and all the office heads. No, I mean, we sit around, and I think one of the things that I've been fortunate, I sit on like a big corporate board. I you know, like both Sarah and Becky, you know, we have a lot of probably outside activities where we sit on different things, but I think people sometimes, or at least I had the naive vision that a CEO sort of decided and everyone ran around and implemented. Really what happens, in my experience, whether I'm in the leader seat or just another person's seat, is it's one giant mosh pit, and everybody comes up with a decision, and if there's sort of a moderator that controls the discussion, it might be the CEO, but it's controlling the discussion, it's not making the decision. Maybe, yeah, at the end they'll make the decision, but it's really much more collegial that way, and that's, to me, the definition of a management team. It's not, there's great thoughts, and now let me lay things out.
Yeah, and I asked the question, sounded a little facetious, but I asked the question because, Becky, you had mentioned the same thing, that was what one of your mentors told you before you were going to take over the position. And so to think about exactly, you know, who it is going to be that's going to be working with you, and who are the key players in your organization that you need to take with you.
Right.
Seems really key. Did
Absolutely.
you also want to...
I would echo the things that have been discussed already. There was something also that was a big surprise to me. My president made this comment and continues to make it. I never really thought about the impact that we have when we walk in the office, when something happens that is terrible, disappointing. Obviously, when good things happen, that's one thing. But people look to you to know how to react to situations. And being Pollyannish and not seeming to react is the wrong reaction.
Yes.
It doesn't inspire people, it confuses them. It makes them think that you haven't really taken in what's happened. But having a very outward, confident path that people can see and expect from you in reacting to situations is very important. And I never thought that people would gauge their own reaction by how you react as a person, but they do. And they gauge how concerned they should be. It's like when a child burns their hand or gets hurt, they look to the parent or the person next to them to see, should I cry about this? Or should I just buck it up and say, no, I'm gonna just deal with it.
They cry.
They cry. So that's one thing I'm very conscious of, is what face am I putting on to the organization. Being real, but realizing you're accountable for how people read a situation by how you react.
We've talked a lot about managing down, but I'd like to ask a question about managing up from a board of directors perspective. How do you communicate your vision of where you want your company to go to a board of directors, if you had one, to give us some advice as to, hey, if you're leading the organization but you're responsible to the board, how do you convey your leadership and your vision to them, and convince them that they should say yes and you should go in the direction you want to go?
Jane, I'll let you start with this one.
I think I'm sort of a governance nut, and our partners are the shareholders of our firm, and we're really crystal clear that when I'm functioning as CEO, I am management and I serve at their pleasure. And so they have to sign off on the corporate strategy. I have to deliver a budget in. You know, I've got certain, even though I'm a decent sized shareholder, I've got limited authorities in my CEO seat. And I think that's really important. And you know, it's just like selling anything. You go in and you explain the case and, you know, you get feedback. And feedback's really, really important. I mean, I think one of the things that I really treasure are when people can be really blunt with me and show me a different perspective or talk about things. I mean, that's, I mean, I'm going to venture to guess that all three of us, all four of us, I mean, the fact that you're a tenured finance professor and an endowed chair is just like off the charts. But anyway, we all probably were comfortable asking questions, and you know, and a lot of people aren't comfortable doing that.
Okay, Sarah?
Well, first of all, it's important to have a board. I just want to point that out. Not everybody does. A real board. We had an outside board member and needed them for a complicated transaction to extricate ourselves from our seed investor who didn't want to leave. Then we had to get rid of that board member because we couldn't keep him for legal reasons, and brought on another who was a huge upgrade. And it made me appreciate having an outsider who's very intelligent about the industry make observations. It's hugely important. So like Jane, I'm a one owner in a partnership that's really tightly bound together. And our COO, who's also a woman, is an incredibly important part of managing the organization. And our president, who's male, is very adept at what he does. So we comprise the board with our outside board member, and those meetings every quarter are essential to get feedback and to compare where we intended to be versus where we ended up, that roadmap. So I'd say the managing up is, as you rightly noted, a really important part of the process.
Thank you, Becky.
No, I'd agree with that. Our board, we have a 6-member board right now, and you know, that size is right for our organization. The board members are actually elected from and by the shareholders. And it's interesting because all the boards we've had have crossed generations of folks at the firm. They've crossed functions at the firm. That has been so incredibly valuable. So really listening to that board is a critical part of making sure you're on the right strategic track. But also, because we have a large shareholder base as well, making sure that they're part of the picture. And although they elect the board members, they're very much part of every conversation. So it's managing up, but it's managing across the table to those other board members. But one of the things that I've found is really critical is because we all have day jobs in addition to being shareholders and board members, is part of our jobs is reiterating what path we're on. Because every day there's so much noise. Every client has a different set of priorities, every person has a different set of priorities for themselves, every manager has a different set of priorities. And I think one of our key functions is making sure we have our finger on that long-term strategy. Once it's been decided as a firm, making sure that you actually follow it and keep it fresh. And if it needs to be changed, then have that conversation. But because we're all in a very noisy world and industry, it's easy to lose track of what strategy you're on.
Just wanted to say a quick thank you to all of you, to Sarah, Jane, Becky, and Andrea.